As Mike Bloomberg often says, if you can't measure something, you can't manage it. And that applies to companies and it applies to countries. And right now, the question of how we're managing the global economy is critically important. It's something we write about a lot at the Financial Times with our partners at Nikkei. And it's something which is becoming very, very important for policymakers. So we have a fantastic group of people to talk about it. On my opposite me is Doug Peterson, who is President and Chief Executive Officer of S&P Global. Next to him is Mariana Mazzucato, who is Professor of Economics and also author of a book, The Value of Everything, which is exactly about this question of what's wrong with GDP. And on my immediate left, your right, is Heizo Takenaka, who was former finance minister, economics minister in Japan, and is now professor at Keio University. Now, the issue of how we look at GDP is particularly relevant because this was basically a 20th century construct. It was created to measure manufacturing, industrial processes that dominated the world in the 20th century. But we've moved on. We have digital world, we have the environmental issues, things that really are starting to impinge. So, Doug, when you look at this issue, as someone who's not an economist, not a policymaker, but in the data business at S&P, what do you think about how we're using GDP today?
Well, first of all, GDP is so critical for us as a CEO and as executive because we use it to make decisions about where we're going to invest. So when we're looking around the world where we want to invest, where we're going to put our new operations, we look to see where is their growth. So it has consequence for people like me to look at where we're going to be investing. When we talked earlier about the new economy, in the old economy, the old GDP that you just described, not only was it built around a manufacturing economy, a farm-based economy, the way that information is gathered is still antiquated. Can you imagine how much information there is at Amazon and MasterCard and new ways to gather information? We can talk more about that. And then another part that's still antiquated is there's many activities that aren't picked up. You don't pick up informal activity, so you don't pick up cash-based activity, which in many economies is large.
So the black market, basically.
Well, no, different. Not the black market. If you
the grey market, or
cash market. Let's put it tax evasion, and then you've got another market. It's homework, people that work at home, and then you have the illegal market. So there's parts of it, and some economies that's up to 35% of GDP that's missed.
Wow. So the illegal market's an issue, or the grey market and the informal
markets.
The digital side's an issue, and of course environment too. But Mariana, you wrote an entire book about what's wrong with this. Give us a précis.
So, well, the book wasn't on GDP, it was actually on value. And of course, what underlies GDP is what we value. So if we're not valuing care, and care is often done for free in the home, then it doesn't get measured. And that's a huge problem. In fact, if you marry your babysitter, GDP goes down. So don't do it. Because a service that was being paid for around care all of a sudden maybe is still being done, simply not being paid for. Anyway, there's lots of weird things like that in GDP. But I think what's interesting is we could actually squeeze so much more out of GDP, even as it currently exists. So much interesting things are being said around the world about what to add to it in terms of well-being and happiness. But even with its current state, you could break down GDP in two different ways, either by income or by product. And if you look at income, so profits, wages, rents, do we really understand the difference between profits and rents today? Rents used to be called unearned income, to the point that most of the financial sector, up until 1970, wasn't even included in GDP because it was basically seen as a transfer, just like Social Security payments. When they did include it, investment banks, the idea was that they're risk-taking. That's the service they're providing. Of course, when they went bust, who picked up the risk? The taxpayer. Anyway, and commercial banks, financial intermediation. But kind of breaking down what actually ended up happening with finance, finance largely ended up financing itself, finance, insurance, and real estate. The extent to which we could also, start breaking down, is it really creating value? Is it extracting value? Which bits are really creating value, and differentiating that? But, even just the other way to look at it would be in terms of demand, consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. A country like the UK is currently mainly growing through consumption, not investment. That consumption is being driven by private debt. So the ratio of private debt to disposable income is back at record levels. That you can see with just GDP as it stands without any happiness, but no one's talking about that. It should be in the front pages of the Financial Times
Okay, well, we're going to come back.
That's what caused the crisis.
We're going to come back in a moment and talk about what can be done to fix this. But the idea that, once upon a time, Wall Street wasn't even measured in GDP might be taken as quite insulting for a lot of the big financial titans. But it also shows the type of problems there are and how statistics just don't keep up with changes in the economy. But Takanaka-sensei, I'd like to ask you, you were in charge of the Japanese economy and trying to set policy using the statistics that you had available. How good were they? Did you trust them?
Well, when I was in the cabinet as a minister for economic fiscal policy, I was asked to rate the GDP.
You were asked to rate GDP?
I was asked by many people to rate GDP. However, how reliable GDP is, of course, we have a lot of problems, just mentioned by other people. However, it is very important to notice that GDP has a relatively short history, right? In 1929, we had the Great Depression. At that time, many people understand the importance of we need some measure to grasp the situation of the economy comprehensively. At that time, in the 1930s and the 40s, many excellent economists like Simon Kuznets and some others, as you know, created this system of national account. And since then, so this has GDP statistics that only 80 years history, just like the human being's lifespan. So during this short period, this had been, amended a lot. Still, we need, at this moment, more new type of amendment. We live in a new economy, but in this case, we should understand clearly what is a new economy. What is a new economy? Well, smart technology. We live in the fourth industrial revolution. So in this regard, first of all, later on we will discuss another aspect, the environment and the sustainability and the inclusiveness issues. But anyway, as far as smart technology age is concerned, Japanese government changed the system, changed the way of calculation of GDP 4 years ago. And at that time, Japan's GDP increased by 3.5%. To be specific, as you know, the R&D investment was also added to GDP. Before that, R&D investment was regarded just as the intermediate expense, expenditure, not a final expenditure. But maybe you understand, R&D investment is a very important investment to create the stock of knowledge. So since then, we are paying very much great attention on the importance of intangible asset. R&D is very easy to understand, but there's kind of intangible asset we have. So, but anyway, so the similar change of the calculation of GDP was taken by Korea, Ireland, and these all countries. GDP was increased a little bit. So, it is very important to know the new age, the post-industrial revolution, the role of intangible asset.
Well, you make a very good point there. And the case of Japan is very interesting because not only do you have, obviously, an aging, shrinking population, and people often say, oh, the Japanese economy is in the doldrums because GDP has not been impressive. But the fact you've brought in the investment into the equation is striking. And the intangible issue is striking too. I mean, Doug, how do you think statisticians should be actually trying to capture the intangible element?
Oh, absolutely. And when you think about some of the aspects of GDP, the measurement, one is the intangible. In some ways, it's almost thinking about utility as opposed to a cash flow or what was measured that has a monetary value. Another aspect is you're not measuring depletion either. So it's because GDP is a flow and not a stock, you could be creating a very strong GDP, but depleting your assets, depleting your some of the things we could talk about, ESG factors, where you're depleting the environment and you're not picking that up. But on the intangible, let me give you an example of what we have today. If you think about when I was growing up, I had to go to the Encyclopedia Britannica to get information. Now I have this little computer in my pocket, and I can get information at my fingertip, and that's not measured at all in a GDP, the information, the substitution of how I get that value. And I'm not an expert in this, but I'm always asking the question, how do you measure utility and value created as opposed to something that is a cash flow or something that's measured in a delivery of cash? One quick example, if I were using a travel agent to purchase a ticket but now there's a new way I do it by using a website. That work didn't go away of booking a ticket. It's no longer being paid for at a travel agent, so GDP might have gone down. But the work created, the value created is still there. So this is something I'm trying to figure out. How do you capture value created and utility?
So how do you? I mean, are there any countries? I mean, obviously, Japan has taken one step forward by including investment and trying to capture some of the intangibles. But are any countries doing this right? I mean, Mariana, you've been looking at these.
Well, all the countries that are run by women. I hate to say, I was just thinking, New Zealand, Iceland, Scotland, Finland. Hey, correlation. I mean, can I just say something? Can we have a bit of time?
Yeah,
Just
sure.
on the issues you mentioned are so crucial. But what you're talking about are drivers of long-term GDP growth. That already becomes another variable. Are we just talking about a little blip in GDP or long-term driver? And you mentioned Kuznets. Kuznets was so clear. He's like, oh, by the way, don't use this to talk about 1.7, 1.78, 1.8% increase.
Remind
in
the audience
GDP.
what Kuznets.
Oh,
Yeah.
One
Yeah.
of the founders
Yeah.
of GDP, which
Yes.
he mentioned, exactly.
Yes.
But he warned, he said, use it for kind of a más o menos kind of a trend, but not kind of, as though you're steering a car exactly where to go. And I think, what's so interesting in Europe, for example, we look so much at the deficit or the debt. And as soon as you divide the debt by GDP, already it becomes more, refined. And so Italy, for example, is always accused that it's spending too much, but it hasn't. Its deficit has been, 2 to 3%, often lower than Germany's, but debt to GDP, very high. Why? Because the long-run drivers of GDP, things like productivity, have not grown for almost 20 years in Italy. And so, again, we could actually, with existing measures, say a lot, but we don't talk about this in Europe. We just told Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, cut, you're spending too much. And the other thing about R&D, that as well, we don't really have an understanding of how to make sure that what we're spending on, in terms of public budgets, are in fact more steered towards these long-run drivers. So R&D is still in many countries just seen as a cost, as opposed to capital expenditure for
Right.
long-run growth.
And especially in software, right?
Yeah.
So software is definitely booked as a cost, but I think of software as almost like a capital investment, but it doesn't get treated like that.
You see, this comes back to the point about if you can't measure it, you can't manage it properly. And this is leading potentially to big policy mistakes. I'm curious, in the case of Japan, because there was so much discussion about the lost decade of stagnant growth, do you think people need to rethink their impression of the Japanese economy if they have a different vision of the Japanese statistics? And I don't mean to pick on Japan, but you are the policymaker on the panel, and there's a lot of interest in this.
Well, it's a very difficult issue because, many people recognize the importance of GDP, of course, because as I mentioned, it shows the very comprehensive economic activity. However, at the same time, some factors should be added. One is the intangible asset issue. Another one is the environmental issue, for example. So we have been discussing this environmental issue for a long time. As you know, in 1970s, already 1970s, we have discussions. Economic Council of the Economic Planning Agency of Japanese government established a new idea of NNW, net national welfare. Net national welfare. In this case, the environmental issue was considered into GDP. To be specific, the imputed cost of environment should be subtracted from GDP. As a result of that, at that time, GDP was reduced by 2%. So some added, some should be reduced. So we have a lot of discussions on that. But still, important point is, we should not depend too much on single indicator. GDP is very important indicator. However, for example, please consider my body condition, weight, height, and body, blood pressure, etc., etc. We could not depend on single indicators. But still, moderate amendment, moderate improvement of GDP statistics needed. But we should consider some other supplemental indicators. At this moment, I think this is very important.
So when you say, you made a very interesting point about the media, that obviously the financial press and the markets tend to hang on these data releases. What do you think people should be talking about on a daily basis? I mean, what should we be putting on the front page of the Financial Times or the Nikkei or the Nikkei Asian Review?
Our books, no. Well, I mean, again, if we come back to what we know drives GDP growth, for example, we know that certain types of institutions are fundamentally important. And even just within Europe, we have very different types of institutions, for example, that link or don't link science and industry. You know, the kind of Fraunhofer institutes, for example, in Germany, they don't necessarily exist in other parts of Europe. And if we think that they're important for having that kind of productivity growth or vocational training, education, R&D kind of spending, then we would be looking on our dashboard in terms of the health of a country, those kind of indicators, as well as, of course, a more refined analysis recently around well-being of the nation and different types of happiness indicators. But then you could argue that then Europe, for example, when it's giving out bailouts to countries that are having problems, instead of having these conditions that are also just about one number, you know, reduce your deficit.
So the
3%,
IMF
0%.
conditions or the ECB numbers saying that you have to do X, Y, and Z based on debt to GDP or deficit.
Yeah, if they want that country to become more competitive, they could actually also be giving more refined advice. Not just reduce your deficit, but hey, you really need to start building these institutions, which we know through evidence base are quite important. But again, that's more of a dashboard understanding of competitiveness and health of an economy.
Right. And these are really profound policy issues which you were grappling with when you were in office. But can I turn to another question, which is there any way to change how we collect data? Because I find it just astonishing that we have these tech giants who have the tools to know what we had for lunch before we even eat it, who can track everything we do all the time and are selling the data to each other and or the whole data brokerage industry. And yet we have to wait for an entire month or sometimes a lot longer to get GDP statistics. Is there a better way to start actually collecting data about the economy? Did you ever try and ask any of your tech companies to help you?
Well, big data issue. It's of course very important. Last year, Prime Minister Abe appeared here, and he made an excellent speech focusing the importance of the data free flow with trust. Well, this is a very important topic that was being discussed in this Davos meeting. But still, for example, we have big data. Data is important. At the same time, well, in order to calculate GDP, various kind of indicators are needed. So you mentioned, well, what we watch, what kind of statistics we watch. GDP is very important. GDP appears only every quarter, once a 3 months. So still it's very limited. So, well, this is still very important. At the same time, we need much more frequent statistics needed. Well, of course, economists have been discussing, as you know, Okun statistics or Okun coefficient like that. For this is the, well, very frequent GDP fluctuation should be reflected in the rate of unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, well, the policymakers, policy analysts are watching this kind of statistics. So in that sense, I'd like to say some kind of dashboard type of indicator. Dashboard type of indicator is needed. For example, World Economic Forum issued the competitiveness ranking. They're combining several, well, 50 or 60 indicators. So the combining these statistics is very important from the viewpoint of policymakers.
I mean, Doug, because S&P is in fact scraping data, aren't you?
All the time.
I mean, in trade, I know you've got some extraordinary activities happening.
Yes, so in the trade area, we have now, we've got access to almost every port and airport in the world. And we extract that data daily unless that port or airport doesn't have it, and then we put it into a database, and we can see, we will know sometimes that Apple has changed the battery they're using or their lens is using before the markets do, because we can see the shipments that are going around the world. So my answer to your question is absolutely, you could be using new data techniques, machine learning, alternative ways to gather data. An example that's happening right now, every 10 years the United States does a census. And this year, the census is going to go out, and they're going to do it in a way that's electronic. And you can do it on your computer using the internet. You can use it on your phone. You can do it in paper. And they only expect that about 65% of the people are going to do one of those three, which means there's still going to be 35% of the people that they're going to have to go hire 300 to 600,000 people as part-time workers to go finish the census. So they're, in the Department of Commerce in the U.S. is attempting this new approach using the phone and the internet. And I do think that it's a good step that they're trying something new about gathering fundamental data, but there's so many more ways you could do it.
But the keyword is fundamental data, and that's different from the speed, you know, how quickly you get the data. Because you could also argue that we have information overload. Do you really need to know GDP figures every kind of 5 seconds? And in fact, you know, getting more refined analysis precisely around the digital economy. There's this great book out called Surveillance Capitalism, and this notion of the behavioral surplus. This book by Shoshana Zuboff. She says that people think they're searching Google for free, but actually Google is searching you for free. And so this whole, again, difference between value creation, value extraction, can we actually start using different types of measures that really tell us the way that we're using the power of the algorithms and new technologies in ways that really contribute to a healthier, more productive capacity in our economy versus a more extractive one.
Yes. Takanaka-sensei.
Well, may I raise another important aspect of statistics? Of course, GDP, our debt GDP ratio, this is very important. It's also very important to get a quick information about from the data. At the same time, by analyzing these indicators, we can understand very clearly the strengths and the weakness of this company, or this economy. For example, in the case of the United Kingdom, for example, investment is high or low, consumption high or low, and so on. So in this regard, for example, I would go back to the intangible investment, intangible asset. Well, in the case of Japan, intangible investment GDP ratio is about 9%. 9%. This is clearly lower than that of the United States. In the case of the United States, 15% or so maybe. But the contents of the intangible investment is more important issue for Japan, for example. While R&D investment, Japanese businesses have been investing for this R&D relatively high. This R&D investment GDP ratio in Japan is not relatively high. However, another kind of intangible investment, especially human resource investment and the expenditures on organizational reform, this is very weak in Japan. So by analyzing this intangible asset or intangible investment, well, we can understand the weakness and the strengths of the economy company. This kind of function is very important to make use of this kind of statistics. This is another important aspect of statistics.
Right. I'm aware that there are a lot of people in the room who are experts in this field and have a lot to say. So I'm going to turn to the audience for questions in just a moment. But before I do, and do start preparing your questions, before I do, Mariana, can you go back to some of the examples you see which are actually encouraging amongst the countries in dealing with this issue? Because, you know, obviously a lot of the economic reporting in the world tends to be dominated by Europe, the Eurozone, America, Japan, big countries. Are there case studies of countries which are being creative and actually doing the kind of things you're talking about?
Well, I think what's interesting is that the conversation's changing from just the measures to, well, what are we even trying to do? So if we have the Sustainable Development Goals, which were signed up to by hundreds of countries, what does that then mean for the value, the kind of economies that we're trying to create? And what's interesting is that at the microeconomic level, that conversation is really having impact on the metrics, right? You know, whether it's ESG or better types of metrics within companies and whether they're really reaching these targets around the environment or different types of social factors. And I think what's interesting is, can we then link that conversation, which is about governance of organizations in business and other, to, given that then we do aggregate up statistics about companies also to get parts of the figures for GDP, what does that then look like at the macroeconomic level? And yet the conversations about the environment, for example, in GDP is not linked up to that governance of the microeconomic unit.
Absolutely, yeah.
And currently I do think, I mean, I'm not the only one who thinks so, that there is a bit of a washing, you know, in terms of talking a lot about the environment. And then if you look again at the figures of what's actually happening in finance, you know, the top 3 asset management companies, BlackRock, Vanguard, and another one I can't remember its name, have actually increased their spending on fossil fuel-based companies by 35% since Paris, since COPs in 2015. So, you know, the talk, turning it into a walk, will be much easier when these metrics, first of all, are mandatory, but also when the kind of micro and the macro really are more lined up.
I mean, Doug, you're trying to bring in these green factors into credit ratings, aren't you? And you're trying, really, for the first time, to systematically look at these non-traditional economic metrics when you look at companies. Can that be extended to countries as well?
Well, I think so, and I think, but to your point, starting at the micro level, so to call it the corporate level, is going to be important because that will drive behavior. If we start measuring companies, we have more standardized approach to measuring E, S, and G factors. Right now, the S is hard to get. There's not a lot out there. The social factors, it's not really very well defined. The governance has been around a long time, and on the environmental factors, it's not consistent. It's hard to get the information. So at the corporate level right now, if we want to get the data, and we're actually gathering ourselves, it's self-reported, it's not audited, it's not consistent, people don't measure it the same way. And in fact, one of the really valuable discussions that we've been having this week in Davos is exactly around that question.
Yep.
In the International Business Council of WEF the last few days, Brian Moynihan led a group of people that came up with a draft of some pilot questions and pilot statistics that we would endorse that all corporations would start putting together. So I think that we can start driving it at a corporate level, a micro level, and have the same dialogue as well at the national level.
And Takanaka-sensei, I see you're wearing a wonderful green tie, which is indicating where the
Yes.
world's going, so well chosen.
Green GDP, yes.
Exactly, green GDP. So tell us, before we turn to questions, do you see areas where Japan could try and do more to measure the impact on the environment? Or
Okay.
rather the other way around, the externalities?
Okay, I use the term, we live in this sustainable and inclusive society. In that sense, we should consider other factors than the GDP or the income. For example, the environmental issue is a very important issue. This is now have been discussed for a long period, and we now have some indicators to show the imputed cost of environment. And additionally, what's the income gap, income equality? This also should be considered. And at the same time, nowadays in Japan, most attention-grabbing discussion is people's health condition. While Japan has the longest lifespan of people in the world, this is not reflected in GDP, for example. So while Ministry of Economy, Trade, Industry is commending some excellent companies for health management, et cetera, et cetera. So this should be considered very seriously from here on. We are moving toward the aging society, aging demography. This would be have a good impact, strong impact on the medical cost, et cetera, et cetera. So, in my impression, security and health and environment, these are very, very attention-grabbing issue in my opinion.
Can I make a comment about this?
Please do.
Japan is actually an example of a developed country in this theme of environmental impact. It's actually much more positive than any others. The energy usage of a per GDP or per capita in Japan is about 60% of the U.S. It's about 80% of Europe, and it's partially because of city design, urban design. Yeah. It's mass use of mass transit. It's the subway systems. It's the trains. People live in smaller homes. And so there's a whole footprint, an environmental footprint, that as we start thinking about other solutions to smart cities and environmentally friendly cities, some places we can look to already or we can see practiced in Japan.
Well, that's fascinating. Of course, one of the whole points about the forum and Davos is to try and get that sort of international learnings from each other. But on that note, let's have some comments from the audience. I know there are a number of you who'd like to speak. Let me quickly see. I can see hands going up already. Let's start with you. It would be courteous but not compulsory to identify yourself. And since we have a number of hands already, please keep any comments or questions very short.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, my name is Abby. I'm a global shaper from London and also the CEO of an early stage tech company. Thank you very much for the panel. My question is mainly for Mariana, but please feel free to input. There is a very dominant narrative in Silicon Valley that government and the public sector is mainly a hindrance, which of course is not true. It would be great if you could maybe share some of your research and findings on how public spending, government spending has in fact been critical to commercializing many of the technologies that we use today. Thank you very much.
So how does statistics show that government is good?
So the phone that your friend there has, is it a smartphone or a stupid phone? It's a dumb phone now. Well, everything that makes your smartphone, I'm sure it's smart, has a little Apple thing on it now, and not stupid, was in fact invested by public institutions, right? So internet, Siri, touchscreen display, GPS. Now, what's interesting, though, is that, again, when these are publicly financed institutions, we also don't really have a narrative to talk about this. So in economics, it's not just the value debate that is so interesting, but the way we think of policy is just correcting something. So we talk about it as correcting a market failure. But actually, what public institutions did in Silicon Valley was, really co-create and co-shape that market. And I think this really comes back to this issue of narrative. I mean, GDP isn't just a number. There's narratives around it, both in terms of how we talk about it in the media, but where we think wealth creation comes from, how it can be that, I think it was Lloyd Blankstein, the head of Goldman Sachs, said in 2009, Goldman Sachs workers are the most productive in the world. And then they were bailed out by, over $10 billion by the US taxpayer. You didn't hear the US taxpayer say, we're the most productive in the world. Right? And a school teacher doesn't say, we're the most productive in the world, because in fact, with public education, when it's free, we only know how to measure the costs, the salaries, not the output. We're still not good at even measuring something as obvious as the value that that a public education system provides. So we literally can't even account for the productivity because we don't have a price for the output. But the big thing about the public sector is that, of course, we need it, but it's not just about kind of wartime, Cold War kinds of technological spending. Coming back to the SDGs, this notion that we really should have mission-oriented kind of spending with real kind of public sector guidance of big directional pushes, and then crowding in bottom-up experimentation also by the business community, or mainly to solve these big public goals. That's a very different way to structure public-private partnership. And I would argue that what we need in WEF is to really also have metrics of how to define an interesting, dynamic, symbiotic public-private partnership going for a goal versus the kind of parasitic predator-prey kind of public-private partnerships we have, for example, in the health sector.
Wow. That's a very good, good point. Right, question here, and then another one next to you, and then we'll come around this way.
Thanks very much. I'm Jonathan Haskell from Imperial College. I'm going to risk unpopularity by defending GDP, if I may, just for a second. And if we just think back to what it is when we teach GDP to the students, sorry, I'm an economist.
You don't need to apologise for being an economist. I think you're in the majority in the room, probably.
We give them the basic intuition, which I think is worth remembering, which is that if we've got an economy which is producing steel and producing cars, the one thing we mustn't do is add the steel and the cars, because, of course, the steel goes into the cars as an intermediate input. So part of the reason why GDP is rather complicated, and part of the reason why, as you were saying, Gillian, it's a bit frustrating. Surely these big tech companies have got lots of information, is they might have information on the various goods, but that's not good enough. What we need is the information to compute the value added on all the various intermediate chains.
Right.
If I could make that one point, if I could make a second point briefly, if I may, which is, in the case of steel and cars, we know what an intermediate input is, the steel that's used up into the cars. As Professor Takanaka rightly points out, when we've got intangible inputs like R&D and software, we don't quite know how to deal with those. Now, at that point, it seems to me, I just want to correct a misapprehension. The national accountants who do GDP have been very energetic in attempting to capitalize intangibles. It's the company accountants who refuse to count up intangibles. So actually, we're going to throw...
Okay, so it's all your fault, Doug.
We're going to throw rotten tomatoes at GDP. Can we just keep in mind that it's got that basic intuition, which is very, very helpful, and that there has been a bit of progress. More to do, but there has been some progress.
Those are great points. And before we have a response, I'm going to take the next question as well, because those are indeed very good points. And then I'm going to ask Doug to defend corporate accountants.
And I'm Eric Brynjolfsson. I'm a professor at MIT, and I very much want to build on Jonathan's comments. He's much too modest.
We certainly have a lot of academic prowess here.
And I'm going to support his view because he's too modest. He actually was the person who's done so much work to bring intangibles into the national accounting. And like him, I see a lot of virtues with GDP, a lot of problems. But there is a massive irony in the information age, which is that we have less and less information about where real value comes from. And that's not necessarily because GDP is flawed. I mean, it was a 20th century construct, great at counting numbers of cars produced or bushels of wheat. It's really not designed for a digital age where so many of the things we get on our smartphones, as Mariana pointed out, are free. The maps or the music or the Wikipedia. anything that has a price of 0 gets a weight of 0 in GDP. Does that mean it has 0 value? No. But that's actually what GDP was designed to do. And it's not a matter of us changing GDP to fix that. Simon Kuznets, as Mariana pointed out, made a number of interesting points. One of them was that do not use GDP as a welfare measure, a well-being measure. But with the exception of the people here, that's what a lot of journalists
Absolutely.
and policymakers and economists are doing. What we need is, as was mentioned, is a dashboard approach. GDP is a measure of production. Let's keep it as a measure of production.
Yes. Yes.
But we're interested in well-being. We need a measure of well-being. That is a fundamentally different concept. That's how much benefit you get from each thing. So if you pay 0 for Wikipedia, but you get $100 worth of benefit, that's what we want to measure. And we have a new measure called GDP-B, the B for benefit, that can be parallel to GDP, that captures those benefits. And it uses some of the power of the digital age because we can do hundreds of thousands, actually millions now, of online choice experiments to assess how much people need to be paid to give up different goods. And ultimately, we will, by this time next year, have a parallel set of numbers, GDP-B, that focus on the benefits to go along with the production cost GDP. And I think then we'll have a piece of the dashboard that Tanaka-san and Mariana and Doug have all been talking about.
That's fascinating. Well, I'm going to keep going around because those are two great contributions to the discussion. I think one of the subtexts is, if you want to understand this, read Mariana's book and click onto GDP.
And Jonathan's book.
And Jonathan's book as well. Sorry, Jonathan's book as well. Sorry, thank you, Marianne. And then you get a good picture of it. But we had a couple of hands waving over here as well, and I want to try and, for fairness, get one person behind me. We haven't got much time left, so if you can be short.
Thank you. I'm Pierre Habard. I'm with the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD, so not an academist, not an economist, a union guy. But one question was precisely, isn't it an irony that we need more access to data to fine-tune our measurement, but as we can see, I can witness it in the discussion at the OECD, that there's precisely less and less information because we are facing a kind of privatization of data with more proprietary and a very broad understanding of what business confidentiality is. So the question is, where do we put the spectrum between perhaps legitimate business confidentiality requirements and the need for more granular and in the end, access to data? If I may, a second question is, I understand the idea of a dashboard having multiple indicators, but from a political economy perspective, what often happens is that decision makers, they need one indicator, not 2, 3, 4. So the question is, should we move toward a dashboard or should we actually replace GDP?
With a composite, right. I'm going to take one last question and then we're going to let you each respond. I do want to be fair to the room. Make sure I get both right and left.
I feel like I'm doing a disservice to your neck muscles, Julie.
No.
So, John Alexander, I'm more a sort of social scientist than an economist. Well, that side of the softer side of social science, should we say. I'm really interested in this thing about measures as carriers of narrative, and particularly with GDP, that what seems to happen with as a sole measure is it then drives what all the other measures that are talked about are. And so one of the things I'm particularly interested in is on the news, what you see reported, the public face then becomes, particularly the consumer confidence index, is something that seems to get a disproportionate level of cover. When, in a world where we are not just consumers, and we're actually the identity construct of a consumer there's a fairly good set of evidence that it's restrictive and maybe prioritises consumption as a strategy for governments, but also that people primed as consumers tend to care less about the environment and one another. I'm interested in whether there's a feeling that things like consumer confidence ought to be a focus of more conversation rather than just GDP, whether that sort of narrative function should be more of the discussion.
So narrative economics. Okay, well, I think we have my calculation. You have about a minute and a half each to deal with those massive existential questions. Doug, do you want to defend corporate accountants and private data?
What I will defend is, first of all, to start off, I do think GDP is still critical. We have a time series, it's been around a long time, and it is the foundation of so many decisions. And it's also used by political world, the financial world. And the question we had here today is how can we make it better? And I think we've heard that the second point I want to make is that there is a massive amount of data available to make it better or to find new measurements, whether it's how we think about well-being, how we think about the education system, how we think about the healthcare system. And I will tell you in our own case, both in the ratings business, our index business, et cetera, we incorporate that kind of information into choosing and making a decision about rating or choosing assets which be included in index. It's not just a simple GDP metric. And then finally, we're in a world where data is now massive. It's everywhere. And every single organization is either struggling with or embracing a data strategy. And I think as part of our discussion here, everybody has to have a data strategy and how they're going to use new machine learning, new approaches to managing large volume of data. And we need to incorporate that back into how we think about GDP.
Right. Mariana.
So that question, which was fantastic, as actually all the questions were, it really is about the ownership and the governance of the data and who it benefits. And personalized medicine has created all sorts of data or is benefiting from big data in ways that, for example, the welfare state hasn't yet. And that's one of the biggest questions. How can we actually reinvent the welfare state instead of decimating it, as has been happening in many countries, and really allow it, for example, what they're doing in Barcelona, every time you click on Citymapper, you're generating data, right? Data isn't static, it's being generated now with people on their phones. And they've been thinking about the new kinds of institutions they actually need. For example, a public repository of the data, which, that would come from citizens engaging with phones across the city, which then would benefit immediately public transport. And the transport infrastructure and ideas about mobility, but really kind of benefiting citizens. But that just requires a whole other conversation, which is about democracy and, again, the commons and the data commons. And it's just that we shouldn't assume that because there's so much data out there and we just need to get access to it, it's going to be good.
Right.
And these questions of ownership and governance are key. Just one quick thing on consumption, just in case it wasn't clear. It's not a good thing when you're growing just by buying things, especially if wages haven't been rising. That mean what's been happening in the UK, and you can see this in the GDP data. That's why I would defend GDP on so many levels. We're just not using it for that. What you can see in the UK is that private debt to disposable income is back at record levels. That is what caused the crisis. The FT, but no other paper is talking about it, and you actually can see that with the GDP data. It's consumption-led growth, fueled by private debt. And that's the problem. That's what causes bubbles to burst.
Okay, let me focus on the 1 point, dashboard over GDP. Well, it's a very challenging question, but my personal proposal is the moderate amendment of GDP is needed, especially considering the importance of intangible asset. But my policy suggestion is sometimes criticized as too radical, but I do not recommend radical amendment of GDP this time. For the reason is, but still, you understand quite well, we have so many difficulties in measuring intangible asset. For example, well, how can get the real value, nominal value, real value? Well, it's a very tough task. But so we should consider the environmental issue, and also we should consider intangible asset, but some moderate amendment is needed. At the same time, well, dashboard type of indicator, we should focus more. So GDP or dashboard, this is both are needed. Then my recommendation is very moderate, steady amendment of GDP is needed, and this kind of effort has been accumulated by many economists here.
Right.
And also, finally, dashboard type of indicator, we should focus more from here on.
Right. Well, thank you. Well, I must say, I find this a fascinating discussion. Thank you to all three of you and also the audience. And I take away sort of 3 main points. One is that clearly there are big challenges right now about how we look at the world around us and measure it. And this has big policy implications. What is encouraging is that there is now a debate and recognition. What's perhaps even more encouraging is that groups like the World Economic Forum are trying to bring people together to talk about this, but it's not going to be easy to fix and easy to come to any kind of new path. So there's a lot of work to be done. So on that note, I'd like to finish by asking Zadia Sahidi, who's the Managing Director of the World Economic Forum, to talk about what you're doing on this front and bring this discussion, fascinating discussion, to a close. So give us the answers.
Well, be careful. Last year, sitting in this very seat, I promised something that we then ended up having to deliver, so I'll be careful on what I say. Gillian, thank you so much for moderating. Thank you to all of we have you're at the 50th anniversary, but 40 years ago, our founder started the Global Competitiveness Report, which was a novel idea that let's take a look at the factors that feed into medium to long-term productivity, and looked at human capital, looked at the institutions, et cetera. Along the way, we've added things like our Global Gender Gap Index. We've added, just earlier this week, our Social Mobility Index, looking at human capital and the future of jobs. And the idea now is, inspired by the work we've been able to do in the last 6 months with our International Business Council on having some convergence around ESG metrics, could we try to help create that dashboard around GDP? So today's conversation has been fascinating. For anybody who would like to be involved in that effort over this coming year, please do talk to me or my team that is here. Thank you so much.
So watch this space. Thank you all.